Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning.
It's great to be here. I'm Stephanie Wiles, and I'm the Henry J. Heinz II Director of the Art Gallery, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to today's program. We're here to celebrate artist Mickalene Thomas and the extraordinary exhibition she created with the Art Gallery's curator of modern and contemporary art, Keely Orgeman. At its core, this multifaceted installation creates context and community for a portrait miniature of Rose Prentice that was acquired by the Art Gallery several years ago. To this, Keely and Mickalene have brought together other rare miniatures, daguerreotypes, silhouettes, and engravings of Black people from the pre-emancipation era. The artist also incorporated the work of emerging artists to inspire even more connections. And one thing that I was particularly taken by was a very elegant spotlight that the artist Mickalene made. Her approach she described as something that could continue like a family tree. For me, the cumulative result of these roots and branches that she built is a very beautiful and new work of art by Mickalene Thomas. So I just wanted to say to all of you, please to take advantage of the break times that Keely and others have built into the schedule to walk through the show. It unfolds itself very slowly. And I think, at least for me and my visits, the multiple visits yield ever more connections and deeper connections as you walk through the show. A project of this scale, of course, takes a huge team. My thanks go to so many colleagues at the gallery, public programs, publications, and editorial services for the beautiful book that will be launched today, graphic design, information and digital services, and of course the Department of Modern and Contemporary Art. We also are grateful to Yale Conferences and Events and Yale Media Services for their ongoing help. Today's panel discussions are supported by the Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts, the Terra Foundation for American Art, and the gallery's Janet and Simeon Burgoon Fund, and the Martin A. Ryerson Lectureship Fund. These have also been co-sponsors of the keynote conversation and the book launch later this evening at Next Haven and the Yale School of Art. Sorry, not at the Yale School of Art, but at Next Haven, and the sponsors are also the Next Haven and the Yale School of Art. Please note, I think Keely, maybe it's not up there, but please note at 5:30 p.m. there will be a keynote conversation between Bernard Lumpkin and Mickalene Thomas with Keely Orgeman as the moderator. And this will be held at Next Haven at 5:30 p.m. and there will be a reception celebrating the release of the book following. Thank you for being here, and Keely, I'll turn it over to you.
Great.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I want to extend a warm welcome to this day of panel discussions, and I have the honor of moderating this panel of distinguished scholars. My name is Keely Orgeman, and I am the Seymour H. Knox Jr. Curator of Modern and Contemporary Arts, and the co-curator, along with Mickalene Thomas, of Mickalene Thomas Portrait of an Unlikely Space. The discussion of this panel will focus on the curation of historical contemporary exhibitions, and particularly those aimed at making histories visible through a contemporary lens. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce our panelists, starting with Dr. Deborah Willis, University Professor and Chair of the Department of Photography and Imaging at Tisch School of the Arts at New York University. She has affiliated appointments with the College of Arts and Sciences, Department of Social and Cultural Analysis, and the Institute of Fine Arts, where she teaches courses on photography and imaging, iconicity, and cultural histories visualizing the Black body, women, and gender. She is the director of NYU's Center for Black Visual Culture at the Institute of African American Affairs. Her research examines photography's multifaceted histories, visual culture, and the photographic history of slavery and emancipation, contemporary women photographers, and beauty. She is the author of several books, including The Black Civil War Soldier, A Visual History of Conflict and Citizenship, and Opposing Beauty, African American Images from the 1890s to the Present. Dr. Willis's curated exhibitions include Framing Moments, photography from the Kalamazoo Institute of Arts in 2021, Home, Reimagining Interiority at Young Arts Gallery, Miami in 2022, and Free as They Want to Be, Artists Committed to Memory at the Photo Focus Biennial, Cincinnati in 2022. Dr. Willis was awarded the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Fellowship and was a Richard D. Cohen Fellow in African and African American Art at Harvard University's Hutchins Center. She was also a John Simon Guggenheim Fellow and an Alphonse Fletcher Jr. Fellow. She was the Robert Mapplethorpe Photographer in Residence at the American Academy in Rome and is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She is also a recipient of the Don Tyson Prize for the Advancement of American Art by the Crystal Bridges Museum in 2022 and was named the Mary Lucille Duray Artist in Residence by the Norton Museum of Art in 2023. That is just Deborah Willis. And next, I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Kalia Brooks, Director of Programs and Exhibitions at Next Haven, located here in New Haven. Dr. Brooks is responsible for the design and delivery of curatorial exhibitions, public programs, artist projects, community engagement initiatives, and the learning environment for the fellowship and apprenticeship programs. Her academic research covers art from the 19th century to the present, with an emphasis on the emergent technologies and African American, transatlantic, and diasporic cultures of the Americas. She holds a PhD in aesthetics and art theory from the Institute for Doctoral Studies in the Visual Arts. She is co-editor of the multi-author book, Women and Migration, Responses in Art and History, published in 2019 and 2022. Dr. Brooks has served as a consulting curator with the City of New York through the Department of Cultural Affairs and was an ex officio trustee on the board of the Museum of the City of New York during the de Blasio administration. Please welcome Dr. Kalia Brooks. And finally, I'd like to introduce Kijo Lee, Chief of Curatorial Affairs and Public Programs at the Museum of the African Diaspora in San Francisco. In this role, Lee oversees the strategic direction of the museum's exhibitions and programs, leads globally on identifying and promoting emerging artists from the African diaspora, and works to expand the museum's reach and influence locally, nationally, and internationally. She is responsible for the overall management and execution of the museum's curatorial vision, including its exhibitions, publications, public and educational programs, and she plays an important role in the organization's outreach, communications, and digital strategy. She does it all. Dr. Lee earned a master's degree in the history of art and African American studies at Yale University in 2013, and she is currently a PhD candidate in the same department at Yale. Lee's first book, Perceptual Drift, Black Art and an Aesthetics of Looking, was published by Yale University Press and the Cleveland Museum of Art in 2023. Please welcome Kijo Lee and all of our panelists as we start our discussion. Okay. Am I on? Yes. Right, now I'm putting on my moderator hat here. And I want to start with this image of the portrait miniature of Rose Prentice, which is at the center of our project, as Stephanie mentioned in her introductory remarks. And all of you, though you do many things professionally, as I just mentioned, have a robust curatorial practice. And all of you, though you were not directly involved with the curation of this exhibition, you have had a hand and an influence on its development. I'll share with all of you the ways in which these three have been involved, beginning with Deb Willis. We had these conversations during the pandemic over Zoom at the very beginning of this project, when I invited you to write an essay for the catalog, and Dr. Willis has contributed a beautiful essay to the book. And Kalia Brooks and I served as co-curatorial advisors at Next Haven in 2019. This was 3 years after the portrait miniature had entered the gallery's permanent collection, and I had spent a considerable amount of time at that point when I first encountered Kalia and was beginning to think about contextualizing this portrait and how to do that. So Kalia was with me from pretty much the beginning of this project. As was Kijo Lee. Kijo, as some of you know, was when she was a graduate student here at Yale, she worked in the Department of American Paintings and Sculpture with Mark Mitchell and me, and did the initial research on this portrait when it was acquired, and wrote the foundational text in an article in the Yale University Art Gallery Bulletin, which was published in 2017, I believe. And when Kijo left to go to the Cleveland Museum of Art, I began to pick up the research from there on this portrait miniature. So all of you have been deeply involved with the genesis of this show. And I'm wondering, my first question is about, from your curatorial perspective, I'd love to hear from each of you about your responses to how the project has developed and unfolded since you first became aware of it in its conceptualization phase. And the second part of that question is whether there are any surprises for you upon the realization of this project, whether that's in terms of the installation or maybe the contemporary checklist.
Well, I was really excited to see this, and I'm really happy to be here. Just to consider, Jock Reynolds has been a dear friend for a number of years, have invited me to enter into spaces here. I was telling Kalia earlier that the research here has been central for my work, and the opportunity to see this image, the idea of the miniature, but also the posing. I was excited to read about the research, the deep research you did on this, and the fact is that her look and her story placed within the context of this exhibition is central. And it's central in terms of, as we think about unlikely spaces, we also think about the idea of miniature in the hand, that's held so closely to the hand. And then the history of thinking about how women, Black women specifically, dressed, and also the way that they had to wear head wraps during the time to distinguish themselves from white women or the desire of white men. And so that story is so evident in this sense of the regal pose that she has. But she's also looking directly at Sarah Goodridge, the artist, who's also sensitive to her history. And I'm reimagining Sarah thinking about migration, thinking about the influence of working in a upper class house, but also how fashion was central to women during that time. So there's a crossing through histories and cultural histories, as well as specific historical references to the way that this is posed. And so I was really excited to see this sense of unlikely space in this image, in this exhibition?
There's so much in that question, those couple of questions that you asked. I remember in our early conversations, one of the things that we spoke about was the Pierre Toussaint miniatures that are part of the New York Historical Society collection. And my experience in working with those and curating at Gracie Mansion, that time frame, that sort of mid to late 18th century, early 19th century, and really building out sort of a more robust experience with what New York City would have looked like in that time, in the time of 1799 in particular. And so what surprises me is that these small depictions have these big histories, and that these histories are not that long ago. And one of the most important things about this exhibition, and what really resonates with me as a curator, especially a curator that comes to contemporary art through photography, is that historical period, the 1830s, right, when photography really is, starting to, find a foothold as an imaging technology, is how recent that is. I mean, it is really a blip on the screen of time. And you being a curator of modern and contemporary art and using this as an opportunity to really show how not so distant these histories are, how flexible our parameters of time really need to be when we're thinking about building out stories and narratives for art and for contemporary art and for our experience of seeing Black people in particular. And I love the fact that this is a Black woman looking at us in this way is just a really incredible thing to do as an exhibition project.
Thank you, and thank you so much. I'm so pleased to be here and see some familiar faces out there. I think that this object has been so pivotal to my own practice and my own practice of looking. So when I first saw it, Mark and I were standing in storage and he just popped it in my hand. So in some ways, it was surprising for me to see it behind glass. So there's like this opening and closure that's happening all the way throughout this exhibition. The way that we're opening up the history means it's closing it to touch in a particular way. And so I think that the idea that, yes, we are centering Rose in all of these ways, and I love what you said about time because I'm a person who takes space-time seriously in the ways that we understand history. And so what I wasn't necessarily surprised by, but moved by, is the way that the arrangement of objects actually shows how contemporary artworks shift our understanding of history, actually change the meaning of that object in its time, not only in ours. And so thinking about how the sort of concentration of effort in producing this portrait of Rose, those single daubs of paint, mimic to me the kinds of concentrated effort it would take to construct that home of Isomalt, right? So what does it mean, since they're both very temperamental materials? So so I think that I might be losing track of the questions, but I think that this kind of opening and closing is happening throughout the exhibition and allows me to think differently even about the space of encounter between Sarah and Rose. What was that space like? Not just the physical space, but that metaphysical space they were creating, because Sarah also had her own pretty radical history. So so I think that as far as surprises, I was surprised by the way that you're able to show those historical works in a gallery space, which is like a dream. But I am more moved, right, by the set of juxtapositions than surprised.
But following that, I like the idea of the notion of surprising, and the surprise is that we rarely talk about miniatures and daguerreotypes and tintypes in our writings, in history. You know, we stick to our medium, and rarely mix the two. And that was really fantastic for me to kind of incorporate this notion of how do we think about handheld, the miniature, but also the daguerreotype and tintype, and the importance of the intimate space of looking. And that's what I found fascinating about this.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think that opens up a good opportunity to talk, or to invite you to talk about particular works of art in the exhibition that have piqued your curiosity, or relationships among those works of art. We have several images of works in the show, and I'm happy to keep
Well,
it. This is one that you were
yes.
referencing in your last response.
I'm kind of obsessed. I think for multiple reasons, this combination of salty and sweet, so the blocks of salt supporting this house of sugar, the ways that it's bowing. So to me, in looking at all of these miniatures, for me, I know that even with all the special care that's taken, any amount of light causes these things to start to disappear or to crumble, and it's sort of a fiction of ours that an archive can hold things still forever. And so to me, Bermudez Silverman's repository speaks to both that fragility, but then also that intensity of practice and dedication to making out of these delicate things. So when I think about daguerreotypes and tintypes, or even the history of photography, I think about the ways that we are constantly couching our image in these incredibly delicate sets of materials, expecting them to last. Even now in our digital age, we're like, zeros and ones are gonna last forever. But I know that there are a bunch of conservators that are fighting to ensure that, that we even have the means, the technology to continue to see these things. And so this particular work, not only because it's compelling in its materiality, but it also seems to speak to me of grasping and disappearance. Again, this kind of open and closing, this grasping at things that are constantly retreating, and what remains are these ever-shifting kind of bodies of memory, but they're always shifting, always moving, and how do we capture, if we take a picture of this 10 years from now?
Right.
If it exists. Right.
You and Mickalene do such just a really fine job of selecting these discrete pieces with all their detail and the way that they help you fill out the thesis of the exhibition, right? But the exhibition is an installation, it is an environment. And I love thinking about it in that way, sort of the different modules or elements that go into creating this environment that you have shared with us. And thinking about that environment, that unlikely space, as a portrait, in a sense, and how you have set up all these disruptions in the way that we categorize and name things relative to our art practice, however we come to art. You have allowed within that installation a real artistic sensibility. You know, artists are so good at this. Artists are so good at just doing what they do, which is always outside of the lines and the confines of what us as art historians and curators then follow behind artists, trying to figure out how we create these sort of frameworks for understanding, to do that thing that compulsion we have to, you know, make things live forever. And so I just love how you allow for that arbitrariness of how we name things, of naming, to really be a part of the curatorial experience of the show, because that's an honesty, right? In all honesty, that's the space in which we're really working in. And to allow the artists to me, that really highlights the artwork in the show, and really creates a platform for that kind of really intimate looking, which is also a part of the experience, right? You have the detail of each of these works in the show really requires the viewer to spend a little time, the bowing that you were talking about, right? Like you have to look at that, right? To see that happening. I just,
And then the sight lines on top of
The
that
sight
that allow
lines.
for that blending.
the bridge, using Micheline's photography as the bridge between the different movements in the exhibition space, is all, I mean, it's just,
Can you go back to this previous one? And in terms of, right. Thinking about, as Kalia followed up, in terms of how do we frame a space in terms of the installation, what really, I guess the important aspect for me was asking a question about this ambrotype, but also asking Micheline, like, it was such an unusual color. The painting was the paint in the wall, the wallpaper, to think about how do we look at upholstery and to look closely at a space where women live, clean, labored, were mistreated, as we can look to the experience of Mary's work. But all of these stories are part of the installation, so it's not left out in there. And then the idea of how these two women, how they imagined, how they really presented their lives through jewelry, photo jewelry, wearing the photo jewelry, but also their look, and then this lock of hair, which is also a part of their hairstyle. So we see the importance of tradition and family tradition in the work. And then as one of the questions, I know I'm pushing forward with one of your questions, you asked what, you didn't say favorite, but one of the most important photographs for me was the banjo player. Having an opportunity to see a woman playing the banjo. We always know the history of banjo through men and minstrelsy, but rarely imagine this history of women musicians, and see that she is front and center. She is posing with her instrument. She is reimagining her life outside of this space. So she's allowing us to see her artistry, and having that opportunity to see also her dress. The fabric in her dress, it looks similar to the upholstery in some of the chairs that are part of the exhibition. And and the artist who decided to enhance the jewelry with gold leaf with her ring in her hand, also considering the idea of how beauty is central to telling a story of 19th century women, when we rarely have a discussion about women and beauty. In the 19th century, it's always the labored body, the abused body. And here is a woman who's giving us an opportunity to imagine her life through this. But when I asked her, I said, this brown is just so unusual and so beautiful. I said, how did you find the palette? She said, it's my skin color. And rarely do you have a chance to think about skin color through an artist's eye, and reimagining the space to see all of this brown space within these daguerreotypes and miniatures and spaces that recreate the idea of what it means and feels to be Black in this country.
it's really fascinating to think about how the body becomes a part of the architecture in that way, or is reflected in the armature of the space. Because I think that is also true of what you're saying about the patterning in the dresses and the upholstery and the furniture. right? Sort of the embodiments of these figures and sort of the actual like furnishings and walls of the space.
This idea of adornment as being essential, and that we do often talk about the laboring body, but not the adorned and adored body, which seems to proliferate through this exhibition. And it makes me think of the sort of misunderstandings, right, of how people might have lived, that beauty was part of what was required in order to live through the traumatic experiences. It makes me think of things like they're now doing research on the Great Dismal Swamp, that space between North Carolina and Virginia they were trying to drain to create a plantation, so using enslaved people to try to drain a swamp in order to create a new plantation. But there were a community of formerly enslaved folks, some indigenous folks, and even a few indentured servants that were creating community in what was considered an inhospitable place. And what they're finding are remnants of adornment, of jewelry, of beautiful furnishings inside of homes. And so this idea that one would lavish gold, right, as a means of sort of pointing to what is happening beyond that laboring body is so essential to, I think, the understanding of the exhibition as a whole. So yeah, this idea of adornment, of intimacy, of sexuality that is of our own volition is an essential component, I think.
Yeah, there's a real lusciousness that you can see through these daguerreotypes, through this ambrotype. There's just a lusciousness to the experience of the exhibition that also comes through in the works that you've selected for the project.
Thank you. Well, I think all of you have alluded to kind of the groupings of works together, the way in which McLean and I have structured the exhibition. If you've seen the show, you would have read in the title wall text that there are 4 thematic groupings: solitude, togetherness, posing, and holding. And these themes were really drawn from McLean's and my observations of the historical portraits. And thinking about some of these details you mentioned, the adornments, which are emphasized, for example, in the theme of posing, or with the theme of holding, considering what is held in the depicted individual's hand and what sort of meaning that might impart upon the contemporary viewer looking at that image today. So taking these details as meaningful and as points of connection among the historical works. But of course, there were a number of ways in which we might have organized the exhibition, organized all these works together, and with the contemporary art included in the show, it might have made sense to include mostly portraits and make it a show of portraiture, Black portraiture. And instead, we were thinking more about drawing forward some of the ideas that are embedded in the historical works through the lens of the contemporary artists, and helping us to think through Black private life and domesticity and kinship, kinship networks, those sorts of ideas, of which there are many. So because all of you are curators, have a curatorial practice, you know that this is just, the thematic organization is just one way in which one can organize a historical contemporary exhibition. It's one of the methods, and I wonder if you could please each talk about other curatorial strategies you've employed in curating your own historical contemporary installations or exhibitions as a way of making certain histories visible through a contemporary lens.
Well, it's really important to connect also Micheline's images in here. When we think of the image of course, my French is not great, but the sleep. How do you say it in French? The sleeper. It's the.
Oh, I don't.
Okay. Anyway, that image where the two women are in bed, this sense of space. How, in terms of Micheline looking at this image from Courbet, but then considering the drapes that Courbet used in his painting to the way that Micheline is using West African fabric design. And how do we think about the contemporary? We're bringing in this sense of peace. We see this, this embrace that is just part of the drape when we see the way that it's all about the embrace within this framing. So when we think about contemporary art, I also connect to Isaac Julian's Lesson of the Hour. I'm really excited to work with him on his project with Frederick Douglass and J.P. Ball as a photographic studio. How do we create a photographic studio from the 19th century? How do we tell a story of individuals going into a studio? And within the show that Cheryl Finley and I curated, Artists Committed to Memory, we wanted to reenact a space that celebrated the photographer, but also celebrated Black people who felt comfortable about going into a studio in Cincinnati, you know, where white people also went into the studio, where enslaved people were not allowed to be photographed, because if they were, and he photographed them, but he was able to document, you know, free and enslaved people. And how I try to work with exhibitions, I'm always trying to retell the story with a sense of empowerment, and not pretending that it was brutal, but also there was the narrative that we rarely have a chance to talk about, the aspects of empowerment and self-emancipation in many forms. And that's how I try to work within the archive, looking for different stories. When I decided to work on a project that's now at the Philadelphia African American Museum, I looked at photographs of Black Civil War soldiers to consider Black men and women who decided to fight for their own freedom, and to stand also in front of a studio, in a studio to be photographed, telling a story for our generation to see, not only for their generation, but because many of them did not survive the war, but knowing that how the photograph would live for 150 years later, to tell their story through photography. And that's how I believe photography is biography, within the creation and reconstruction of an individual.
Everything I know about art and exhibitions comes from Dr. Deb, so I agree with everything that she just said. I would also add to that, in terms of my own curatorial focus, I am just enamored with the complexity around the material life of Black and brown people in this world context that we're in, and how absolutely little there is in terms of representing that experience in the world, and how we are all just scratching the surface of what that is. And so just to add to what Dr. Deb said, I also emphasize agency and expertise when it comes to working with artists of color, telling stories about the life of Black and brown people, and our absolute mastery of working with material culture, or developing material culture out of a complete sort of disorientation from, you know, being in a diasporic experience, right? And still becoming masters of materiality in spite of that dislocation. I think there's a real genius and brilliance in that is often sort of either not talked about or completely, the story's been rewritten, credit has been removed, authorship is not ever attributed, and there's just so much of that, and that's what really drives me as a curator is finding that materiality or creating stories that point to that being the reality, both historically and in a contemporary sense.
It's wonderful. And maybe picking up on both threads, I think part of my own curatorial practice is always this power of juxtaposition. We were just talking about this. Survey class had a real impact on me. Like those early, like just put these two things together and talk about it. I mean, partly because I was a TA for Alex Nemiroff's survey, where you might see a still from a 1940s monster film next to Peter Bruegel,
Right.
talked together as a means of getting at some esoteric point of history. And so I think that's always been the way that my mind works. I also didn't go to college till I was 30, so I have all the images before people told me how I was supposed to unpack them in my mind as well, so that becomes part of the juxtaposition. So I think at Cleveland, I did an exhibition called Currents and Constellations. And so it took place in the Focus Gallery, but I never wanted it to be like, oh, let's pop in the Focus Gallery, find out about Black art, and move on with our day. So instead, it was a series of themes that were inside this one gallery, but also a series of interventions through all the permanent galleries. So having a Doc Thrash Carborundum print inside of the German Expressionism galleries, because he was developing a method for actually making visible what it means to be Black in America by using light on top of dark instead of dark on top of light to pull out in a print, just like someone might be using a different palette or different type of textures to express one's interiority in the German Expressionist movement, or adding one of Norman Lewis's ink drawings, because he was pretty invested in East Asian painting and writing, next to Alabama 1960, because the idea that many people have is that Lewis was only painting out of protest, but he was a painter's painter. So how do we broaden those contexts in different ways, or even in my own writing? So have an essay in Ashley James's catalog for Going Dark, in which I'm talking about Lorna Simpson's ink paintings, these monumental ink dredge paintings. But I think about it, if we explode it all the way out, she's actually painting a cosmology of Blackness that speaks to its infinitude. So how do we get at that is I started with blue and the history of blue and how we didn't have a word for it in early history, so it was called all sorts of things, and it wasn't until we could manufacture it. And what does it mean that optical quality scripts our movements is then used in this painting? So I think that this kind of way of juxtaposing, but then, and explaining, but also leaving all of this room for what does this juxtaposition present in your body? How can you be considered a body amongst bodies and interact with them that way? I feel like the ways in which this exhibition is presented also reflects that idea in my own work of how do you both present and guide, but leave incredible amounts of space for your own intellectual imagination and spaces to explore as well.
Keisha, I wonder.
Sorry, I tried to tape this thing like I don't move, and I move all the time, sorry.
You're gesturing too much.
Terrible.
Because you mentioned juxtaposition, I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about what you find to be effective about putting together unexpected pairings.
I mean, honestly, it stops someone. There are ways in which people who often go to museums, you start to adopt a kind of I don't know, this glaze where you've seen things before, so you're either just looking for the thing that strikes your eye, or you're looking for to be told something new. And so sometimes it's just the power of, well, wait, what even is this? Right? So when I think about things like the objects that are painted black in the exhibition, it made me stop for a moment because I'm like, now what is this? And what does it mean in the context here? So honestly, that to me is so powerful, is to actually stop someone in their tracks in a museum. It's harder than you think. And I think that it also speaks to the idea that we are moving along with the times. Like this idea of disciplinary purity is so destructive to telling any kind of real history, but also that there is a depth to those disciplines, right? So none of this is like surface information that just gets jammed together and you make a decision. It's more like, if you go deep, you find these commonalities that can only be found if you go deep.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that all of you have been, so positive in your responses. That's very meaningful to me. But I also wonder whether we could talk about some of the disadvantages and or the limitations of putting together works of art from two distinct historical periods, and particularly when you're dealing with histories of oppression and subjugation, including histories of enslavement. Do you see that there are such limitations to this approach?
No.
No.
I mean, why make it difficult? This is a story that has not been told. And, I found when I attended the opening and I went through the gallery earlier, I just felt as a viewer, this is an opportunity to look at silhouettes and photography. Photography was not, quote, an art form, viewed as an art form, but it was used to document, but also used to reflect and have reflexive moments in this experience. So I rarely try to look for what's missing. I didn't see what was missing in here, and I really felt that it was important for me to just acknowledge these beautiful faces that we rarely have a chance to see or to talk about or to reflect upon. I remember when working at the Schomburg in the 80s, going through the Schomburg collection, looking for different stories to tell through images that highlighted a voice that was silenced. And this is what I find in this exhibition that is, and I'm not saying that this show is positive, it's just representative of a great collection to explore new ideas with narratives that can be expanded upon the images that have been neglected over time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I curate shows like this,
Yeah.
I understand the style.
Right.
I think it's nothing happens in a vacuum, right? Like, I look at pictures, I read books, I look at paintings, I write. We are always engaged in different kinds of materials. I think, with this style of exhibition making, you are, sort of challenging the way we're taught to look in these kinds of spaces. But that can only be positive, right? Because you want to be able to put forward alternate points of view. I mean, that's what we're engaged in. We are engaged in, as you were talking about, creating space for intellectual engagement and imagination. We have dedicated ourselves to bolstering that in everything that we do, not sort of, minimizing or shutting shutting that down, at least in my experience. So, you know, also as curators, we work within limitations. We set up parameters for ourselves. We are supposed to do that. We acknowledge from the very beginning that we are not going to be able to take on every single piece of every single thing, and smartly so, because otherwise that would just be ridiculous, right? So you acknowledge the parameters at the very beginning and you work within those, and then that's how you create a resolute project, knowing where your limit is and what could be the next thing, right? Our practice is iterative. The show was up for 2 months. You know, it's like, you put it forward.
We
you
got
do-
it for 4 months.
4 months.
Yeah.
You spend years on a thing. It's on view for 4 months, and then you're thinking about the next set of parameters that you're going to do to create the next project.
Right, and everyone asks, what's your next
Yeah,
project?
what's
Yes.
the,
Yes.
wait, just slow down a second. Let's look at
I'm
this.
still
But just,
in
but,
this,
but
yeah.
just like Carla Williams and I did the book on the Black female body, and when we uncovered what Mary has taken it beyond what we saw, we were just astonished, horrified, and because we were taught Thomas Eakins and his images living in Philadelphia. I grew up with, idolizing his storytelling, his work. But when we discovered the young girl and nude on the sofa, her mother's working for him, and to see that image, we were silenced. We teared, we cried, but to see what Mary did with it years later, to ask that question, to unpack the man, to think about child abuse, to think about complicity, think about the mother, what her story. And I really applaud you for doing that for me personally, but also for the field, to ask that question. And so when we, in terms of parameters, we were thinking, we wanted to just to look at the history of the Black female body, how it has been presented, how it has been talked about. But then the silence is that when we could not think about the political aspects of women who were put on display in the studio or in world fairs. And this exhibition is also, that's why I said that there's no positive, negative. There's a lot of images that we just really need to explore and ask different kinds of questions that have, and when you talked about in the studio or in the classroom, when I studied art history, with the two images that we had to talk about and critique and think about, but none of the professors were looking at women or Black women during that time period. And so this was an opportunity for me when, and also with Carla, when she was a student, 20 years after I was studying and saying the exact same thing, asking the same questions. What are we missing in these history books? And so you've offered us a new intervention in the history of visualizing the Black body and exhibition spaces.
Yeah, and not a detraction, but maybe one of the challenging things about those kinds of juxtapositions is Black women's bodies are still freighted with that history. So you can walk through that space, not read one label, and make all sorts of decisions about what you're seeing based upon whatever that freight is for you. But to me, that isn't something that is a detractor. It is something that's going to happen. And it's to persist, even in the face that that not everyone who encounters that space is going to have not even a right, but a open comportment to receiving something different than they've already understood about the people and the space that they're seeing. So to me, that's always a kind of challenge to making these juxtapositions. Yeah.
Are there other kind of challenges or limitations that you see, Kijo, in your experience of bringing together historical and contemporary art?
I mean, I think it's just based on your own personal sort of boundaries and parameters. So for me, in this idea of the collective care that I want to take of Black people in my exhibitions, I don't show overt images of damaged or violated black flesh. It just, if it is attenuated in particular ways, if it is around what the arts, but that just is a thing for me that, because I can't be there to caretake every single person walking through that space, it is okay with me to have that be, it will be in the background, it can be a part of the conversation, but it just isn't something that I am willing to do. Now, will I say never? I never say never, but I'm 50 now, I don't know when it's gonna change, but yeah.
It's a parameter.
Yes,
you place.
yes.
Yes, yeah, on the curatorial practice. And we're just about to turn the floor over to the audience for questions and answers, but just to go back for just a quick moment to the, oh, I do know how to use this. Yeah, these are the 3 works by Mary Enoch Elizabeth Baxter, who's seated here in the audience, and will be that Dr. Willis referenced in her remarks. That will be, and Mary will be part of a conversation happening at 3 p.m. today, along with 2 other artists whose work is included in the exhibition. And I'll just, before we turn the floor over to you, also encourage you to go up to the exhibition and look at some of the works we've discussed during these break moments. So I think we're ready to take your questions, and if there, okay, I see one. It's hard to see, sorry.
I don't know if this is, okay. Hi, thank you all so much for a really wonderful discussion.
Can you wave your hand so we can see where you are?
Yeah.
Sorry, I don't know why.
It's just because it's bright.
It's a
Very
light.
bright.
There's, yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, hi.
Okay, I see you now. Okay.
I'm really interested in particular what Kijo was saying about this conversation about the juxtaposition of the contemporary works with the historical pieces. And what I noticed in the show is that some of the works, in particular Nicolene's work, Mary Enoch's work obviously, and Betty Saar's, are speaking to histories of representations of Black women that aren't present in the show. That kind of like Kijo, like you said, that you wouldn't want to use those images in the show of, you know, Egan's actual images, or perhaps stereotypes of Black women that are presented, or derogatory images of nude Black women. But it's interesting, I find, in comparison to the historical works that are in the show, which for the most part, aside from the key piece, were commissioned by Black people and or chosen representations of themselves. And I'm curious about this like almost tension between the contemporary works that are speaking to images that were surrounding the images that Black women and men, there are couples in the show as well, produced of themselves.
Okay. I am losing it. Tell us the question because it's like really great how you were reflecting on it, but I would love, what is the question that we could really kind of respond to, that she could respond to?
Sure. I guess for all of y'all, I'm curious about this, the reference to images not present, and what role the contemporary works do, but also what that says about the key piece of Rose Prentice, which was a piece not commissioned by her or kept by her. So I have lots of thoughts, but hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, it seems to me like there's like this question of this idea about ownership of one's image, and yes, pointing to, so, you know, the sort of mammy figure that you find in Betty Saar's piece, the only other connector is the tignon, the head wrap in Rose's portrait. So where in fact in the other contemporary pieces do these caricatures reside, or do these images or tropes that we've come to know, where do they reside? And there is a tension there, but I think it's a purposeful tension. This is more a question for Keely and Mickalene, but to me it felt like a productive tension to say, you're not going to witness the images you see over and over. It would be no surprise to my mind to find those photographs of Black women holding white children, or to find, I think we've seen those over and over again, but these are bringing some of the images that aren't as often presented. And I'm always interested in how we even know which photographs were self-motivated and which ones were not. Sometimes we don't have that information, but we still use photography to leap into it and say all of these things about the sitter. So to me, there's that tension in photography itself around, I'm also shooting all over the place, about artifice and reality. But I think that, to my mind, that was a productive tension, because if you're sort of looking for those reference materials, you're kind of looking for the thing to make you really comfortable that you understand this context. And what the show seems to be pointing to is we know nothing. Like, there will always be these spaces in between, and that missing figure or those missing images, I feel like many people have kind of a storage of those in their mind already, so it wasn't necessary to have them in place. I might have actually distracted from, then it would have been about a comparison between the two and what the trajectory of the free person was versus the enslaved person. How can we divide and conquer and figure out the textures of those two lives, rather than thinking about Black life conceptually in the ways that the show was trying to shape?
Yeah, just to follow that, there's, that sense of missing image is, I gave a talk in Poland, this talk that was about Black life, and it was a story that I believed in, and some of the images. Finished the talk, and one person said, well, where are the images of the lynching, Black men, because that's all we know. We want to see we want to attend a lynching, basically, and talk about those images. So when we think about quote unquote missing narratives, it's because that's the story that's always told about Black men and the abuse of the Black body, or that type of image that is embedded in our mind. So I want to show images that explore a broader history. Yes, we know the history, but also to think about the head wrap. I mean, the aspect of the shame of the head wrap. But when we think about the history and having an opportunity to have a publication that talks about this 18th century rule that's basically that was created by white men and legislated through that, but also the image of women who were protecting their hair when they worked in the fields, and it was not negative, but because we're embedded with the story of quote the mammy image with her head wrapped, that there is a sense of shame. So I think that it's always important to have not only that one story in there, and because it's referenced in our books and it's in our mind and public culture for a long time. So I think that it's really important to have when that sense of missing image that's kind of representative of a new and different narrative.
Hi there, thank you so much. My name is Jenny Parsons, and I'd love to hear more about the choices of the design of the installation and the presentation of some of the specific objects. I haven't seen the exhibit in person yet, excited to do that, but I loved hearing that the choice of wall color came from the artist's skin, and just looking at these installation photographs, it seems like the choice between dark and light sets this very effective tone, appealing to our emotions, perhaps bringing senses of honor or discovery. And so from a curatorial perspective, I'm interested in the fact that many of the objects are also spotlit, which is it seems beautiful from these photos. But was there any discussion or challenges between installing light-sensitive objects, or how did I'd love to hear more about how this came about.
Thank you for the question, Jenny. Many challenges of installation arose in the 4-year project, throughout the course of the 4-year project. I first just want to mention, because you mentioned the paint color choice, and it's true that this, the brown color was Micheline's choice and recommendation, and one that she has used in other exhibitions. But there are 2 wall colors in the show. There's also a deep gray blue that we, after receiving that recommendation, we paired with the brown. And it's been fascinating to see the installation come to life, especially with the painting of those walls, because we did not know how complementary they would be, how much the eye, and maybe it's perhaps due to the low light levels, blends together those colors and perceives them as a single color, which often happens. And in fact, the brown color goes on purple. When the color is wet, it's purple, and then it dries into this beautiful, rich brown. The lighting you mentioned also, Jenny, is largely dictated by the lighting restrictions required by the many lenders to this exhibition. So only the portrait of Rose Prentice is part of the Yale Art Gallery's collection. All 44 other works were borrowed from private and public collections, and with the historical works in particular, each came with its own lighting requirements, and that meant that our very skilled, incredible exhibitions team spent at least a year developing one of these wall-embedded cases here that you see throughout the show, so that each portrait could be illuminated within the specifications of that loan. And then we used the same kind of soft velvet-like material for the upholstery inside those cases too. And so these little details from the low light levels to the upholstery to this kind of case that you see around the show are meant to tie things all together. Whereas if you knew about all of these different lighting restrictions, you would see that there are almost imperceptible differences between each one. One is lit at 3-foot candles and one at 5. You know, some of the contemporary works are illuminated at higher levels. But what Micheline and I have really tried to do is use those restrictions and use them to our advantage in creating this kind of atmospheric, evocative space that is meant to reference the early 19th century period in which many of the depicted individuals lived. I will definitely go into greater depth with you but yeah, those were among our choices for the installation design.
That was a great question to end on, you know, just to have that as we walk through. As we walk through the exhibition. Oh, there's another.
Yeah, Jock Reynolds, I'm curious, Keely, if you and Micheline, when you thought about the decorative arts furniture you put in the show, both in terms of scale and the fact that the chairs and the ottomans were so pristinely upholstered, nobody, when I was up there, ever even thought that they were going to sit down in those. So what was your intent by presenting those with a sense of scale relationship to everything else that was so much more small and intimate as a pace of visual information we encountered and had to think about who sits where?
Thank you for that question, Jock. In fact, the upholstered furniture we decided ultimately, there was sort of a back and forth conversation about whether to use the furniture as seating for visitors, which is often part of Micheline's practice in presenting these immersive installations. But ultimately, we decided that they would serve as artistic props within each of the tableaux. So they are works of art. You know, they include Micheline's designs, and those designs are based on historical images of quilts and clothing hand sewn by Black women, and Micheline has created designs with based on those historical sources and remixed them in each of these configurations that you find in different areas of the show. You mentioned also the furniture. So rather than using, for example, the gallery's incredible collection of early 19th century furniture for the display of these works, which we considered at some point, we wanted to rather evoke the period rather than use these really kind of literal objects to represent that earlier period. So consulting with the curators of American Decorative Arts on the kind of vocabulary that we could bring into the exhibition is what we ultimately decided to do. And we created those pieces of furniture, like the center table, the cabinet, the fireplace surround, from scratch with our exhibitions team using historical source images. And the scale is really meant to draw attention to the intimate scale of the historical works themselves. So the center table, just to use one example, on which the portrait miniature of Rose Prentice is displayed, is a much smaller scale than one would find with an original piece of early 19th century furniture. Does that answer your question?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
But I love the fact that we're ending on the exhibition
Yes.
installation. And so thanks for those two questions that related to.
Yes, thank you very
All
much,
right.
everyone. This concludes the first panel. We'll break for lunch now, and we will return at 1:30 for our next panel on the topic of scholarship. Thank you.